Hey, good Friday afternoon, everybody. BM Weather Meteorologist Brett Waltz here, giving you a long-range forecast update, guys. I hope you all are doing well this morning. We have a lot to chat about today, from potential severe weather next week to an active pattern to a big warm-up to start February, and then potential for additional cold blasts and winter storms as we work to the middle to the back half of the month of February. I think that people could be caught off guard, given how warm it's going to be to start out the month, of additional Arctic air blast towards the middle to the latter part of this month. Now, I do think, and I continue to emphasize that I think February is a volatile month. I don't think we get a consistent cold stretch, consistent locked-in pattern like we had at times throughout January. We don't have quite as much blocking over Greenland, just not quite the same type of a pattern, but there's still winter left in the tank, and I really want to highlight that in today's video. Before we get to that, let's start out here. We have a pretty big storm system down here from the Gulf Coast all the way up towards the Midwest and the Northeast. Some mixing going on in the interior Northeast right now, some heavier rain near Chicago, a big dry slot through here, still some kind of mist and drizzle and fog in the middle of this, but this is the first bigger system that we've had develop, and we're going to see a lot of these over the next several weeks. Now, I do real quick want to talk about one of the next ones as we work into next Wednesday and Thursday, and one of the earlier severe weather threat maps that I can remember this early in a year at least, for February 5th to 6th this far north, looking at the potential for severe weather from parts of Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, Tennessee. As we work into next week, there's actually numerous pieces of model guidance that support this idea. Our global winds right now are very weak, La Nina-like. That does tend to enhance severe weather threats. And so this is something that we need to monitor. I think it was maybe last year or the year before that we had severe weather and tornadoes in Iowa and the upper Midwest in February. And so, it's certainly happened a little bit as of late, but I think this is even earlier than what happened with that event up in the upper Midwest. Here's a look at an experimental severe weather probability forecast. This did well last season, picking out some severe weather, and you can see it's indicating the potential in parts of the Ohio Valley and even the Southeast Plains as we get into next Wednesday and especially into next Thursday. So something to keep an eye on in about 6 days' time. That we will be monitoring very carefully. Now, in terms of heat and demand, a couple of things that you're going to know. Number one, over the next, let's say 7-8 days or so, demand going to be well below normal. Here's our normal lines up here. You can see, while there are fluctuations, you can see the ups and downs, all these storm systems in here, generally below normal. Now, I do think that there can be a stretch in here as we get into the week 2 time frame where we've got 3 to 5 days of normal to maybe even above normal demand. And then what happens is we go back down again. Another storm system, another warm-up. And I think that some of these fluctuations are going to continue at least through the middle part of the month. If we take a look at what that looks like in terms of the actual surface temperatures here, guys, for the next several days, you can see temperatures extremely above normal at times across the southern tier of the U.S. You're talking about 15 to 20 degrees above normal there in parts of the Tennessee Valley through Texas. Look at the cold, though, up to the north. The coldest air of the season for the Pacific Northwest into the Canadian prairies, and probably even the northern plains in some cases. And that is going to be a consistent feature as we go through the early part of February. Out ahead of that storm system that could produce severe weather, temperatures more than 20 degrees above normal in the Ohio Valley and the Tennessee Valley. It's going to feel like spring for a couple of days in here as we get into next week. But then behind that storm, a bigger cold front, you can see the warmth moderates. We actually have some cooler air for a time that builds in towards the 10th to the 11th of the month. This is kind of that period where there could be some more above normal demand. But as we've talked about at length, things continue to be volatile. We warm right back up as we close out the week 2 time frame with some much above normal temperatures returning to the southeast. Core of the cold retracts back to the west. And so first week of the month, to kind of break things down, mild, especially across the southern and eastern tier of the U.S., very cold across the Pacific Northwest. We go into week 2, we get a cool down, we squash that warmth for a little while, but then the warmth comes back in the east late the second week of the month. This is all, in my opinion, related to the MJO, and I want to look at this and kind of break this down for you all. So the first week of the month is going to be heavily driven by MJO Phase 4. It strongly favors the warmth across the south and east U.S. and the cold in the northwest. matches up almost identically with the EPS the first 7 days of the month. You get into MJO Phase 5, which we should start to feel in the medium range, and things moderate. In fact, the EPS forecast here, this is day 7 to 12, so February 7th to 12th or so, the cooler air bleeds a little bit further southeast, the warmth retreats a little bit, and you have a stretch that's not as warm. But you get into MJO Phase 6, and that's our tropical forcing moving into the Pacific Ocean, thunderstorm activity moving towards the dateline, and the warmth comes back in the east, and your cold is locked up north and west again. The key to this is what happens once we get to Phase 7, which should happen shortly after the midway point of the month. You get to Phase 7, the cold unleashes in a little bit more of a widespread and a little bit more of a notable fashion. Still some warmth on the East Coast, perhaps. But I think that once we get to 7, winter's back on. And I think that 7 could produce some rather notable cold shots for the central part of the country. And at times that can bleed east. It just won't be as consistent in the east as, again, January has been with some of the cold shots. Now, again, the timing on this, guys, what I'm showing you here, this is specifically the 17th to the 23rd of the month, or the 16th to the 23rd of the month. That's kind of when I think that if there's a more notable colder stretch, it's probably going to be in there. Before that, warmth south and east, and at times up and down. But I think that there is the potential mid to late month for more widespread cold threats. Now, one of the reasons that I still think that the volatility continues is our global winds are negative, which just means La Nina is having a big influence on the pattern, which means that southeast U.S. warmth can linger around. I think that's going to be hard to completely get rid of throughout the month. I don't see the center of the cold really consistently ever being east as we go throughout February because of the La Nina forcing. Taking a look at the MJO forecast here, guys, you can see Phase 4 in the short term, then Phase 5 in the medium term, getting into Phase 6, that should be that mid to late week 2 and into early week 3 warm-up, and then you get into Phase 7, and that's when the cold should get a little bit more widespread. And again, guys, I think the GEFS Weekly is seeing this very well. If we take a look at just the evolution, there's our little cool down there in early to mid week 2, and we warm things back up, and then look at the cold expand back east in a little bit more of a widespread fashion here as we go through, the 16th to the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, out kind of towards the end of February. And another reason why I think that there's merit to this colder idea, mid to late month, is what I'm seeing with the blocking in the high latitudes. There's another driver that we look at, which is our global wind transports, that basically tells us whether wind is being transported to the high latitudes, to the mid latitudes, to the low latitudes, and it helps give us an idea of whether we can get high pressure over the Arctic. Based off the current signals that I see, we should pick up blocking high pressure warmth over the Arctic here as we get into mid to late February. What does that mean? Well, it means that it's going to consistently shove our cold air source down towards the U.S., which means that with storm systems, there is going to be a tap to colder air. Now, again, you still have some southeast warmth. Again, I don't think that completely goes away, but the tap to cold air is going to be there, certainly a lot more than where we are going to be to start out the month of February. And with that in mind, here's a look at our weeks 3 and 4 forecast, and this almost takes you out through the end of February. Much below normal temperatures across the north central U.S., the Pacific Northwest. Below normal temperatures in this period can bleed further south. I think that there can be some cold shots in Texas. I think there can be cold shots in the Ohio Valley, in the Northeast. I think that these areas aren't as consistently cold, but we've had a lot of questions. Can Texas get another cold blast? Can they get back down into the 20s? Can there be more freezing issues down here? My answer to that is yes. I think that behind storm systems, you can dip some of these much below normal temperatures into Texas, into the south central U.S. Just won't necessarily be locked in. I think that as a whole, though, this period averages out colder than normal for a good part of the country, with the warmth lingering southeast, which means that for this period, heating demand goes back above both the 10 and the 30-year normal. In terms of precipitation, with that gradient cold north, warm southeast, it should continue to be very active. And this is a region where I think that more winter storm opportunities are certainly going to be available. Not guaranteeing anything, but I think that there is the potential for more winter storm threats as we get into mid to late February with a very active pattern. Now, with that in mind, in terms of February as a whole, here's how the first 2 weeks average out. Very warm across the southern U.S., and that's something we have to factor into our outlook. But if you look at overall analogs for weeks 3 and 4 and for February as a whole, this is kind of my mix that I used this morning. Some familiar years like 2022, 2019, it was an El Nino, but actually somewhat similar with the background forcing right now. Years like 2001, 94 have been ones we've used for a long time. I think 2001 may actually be the best analog right now for February and maybe even beyond that. And this is what they look like. Cold across the northern and western U.S., warmer southeast, and very active as well. This is a very active storm track across the eastern part of the country. And so ultimately, considering that, factoring in our weeks 3 and 4 forecast and how warm it is to start the month, here's where we average things out. Again, the month starts out warm. It gets a little bit colder as it goes on, but I still think there are ups and downs. Keep in mind, I don't think that you're necessarily locked into what you see on this map the whole month. There's going to be fluctuations. That's just the nature of this upcoming pattern. In terms of demand, I'm right around the 10-year normal. We start out well below normal. I think we go above normal, which puts us right back around the 10-year normal in terms of the month as a whole. In terms of precip, looks very similar to weeks 3 and 4. It's an active pattern. It's one that I think can offer up more snow opportunities as we get into the back half of this month. Real quick before we go, one of the reasons why I have a little bit more confidence today of the cold at least being more pronounced at times the back half of February is what I am seeing with the polar vortex. And this is actually the upper level pattern that we're seeing over the next several days. What you'll note, very warm high pressure surging north over Alaska, very warm high pressure surging north, over Scandinavia and over Asia. When this happens, it tends to prod the polar vortex. It sends heat into the stratosphere, which down the road should help the polar vortex weaken. In fact, both the European and the GFS last night trying to split the vortex into two pieces. If this were to verify, we're 14, 15 days out, so it's not a slam dunk, but there is some support for it. If this were to verify, there's the risk that the late February pattern could even get a little bit colder. But I think even more than that, what the implications would be if we can get a full reversal of the winds in the stratosphere. You can see this green line. Look at this 0 line here. This basically means a full reversal of the winds in the stratosphere. When that happens, you tend to get lingering impacts all the way months down the road. And some of the data is hinting at that. If that does happen, the implications would linger into March and into April. Years that had a polar vortex split, that weren't in an El Nino, in the month of February, tended to be cold in March and tended to linger cold in April. 2018 being the most recent one. You can probably remember that. We had late season snow all the way into early April. If that split happens, the cold impacts would linger beyond February. It would not just be a late February thing. We would likely see a continued wintry pattern into spring, very different from last year. And so I think that's important to keep in mind in terms of, preparing for additional winter storm and winter weather risk late into the spring, but also in terms of planting. This would suggest maybe planting delays being possible because of a cold active pattern lingering into early spring. This is something we need to watch carefully. If this vortex split happens, confidence would increase even more about a cold start to spring and potential delays in getting out into the fields as we work into the planting season. So this is a big deal. It would be a big deal for cold late February. It could be an even bigger deal beyond that. That's all that I have for today's forecast. If you all have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.